Okay guys, welcome back. So Ciaran again from the Dublin Academy of Education, and just here to wrap up Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. So we're focusing in this class on our last two chapters, chapters 22 and 23, and again operating on the assumption that you've all read the content. If you haven't, pause now, go read the chapters and then come back and resume this, because I will be very much discussing this with a view to an acknowledgement of the fact that you already are familiar with the content. So I suppose this chapter really trades on this is kind of answering a lot of your questions. So I'm sure that you're a lot happier now or more miserable, depending on, given the general vision viewpoint, I suppose, of this particular text. But certainly there's some element of resolution to this. So if the visit is the climactic moment in this narrative, the resolution really is sort of what Kathy and Tommy learn, what we learn as readers, and then sort of the final chapter, chapter 23. So really, chapters 21 and 22 are actually the two chapters really that kind of paired together really answer all our questions. It's all to do with this visit to Madame and what we learn on this visit. So quite a number of things, I suppose, to consider here. So the truth about Hailsham is revealed in this chapter. Significant things that we learn, and I mentioned this, I think I jumped the gun a little bit in yesterday's lesson around the discussion on the deferrals. It's really only in this chapter that the deferrals are confirmed to be a rumour, that the gallery is real. I've just put this in inverted commas because real as in, yes, like the students were quite right about what it was for and what its purpose was. It was never a gallery per se, it was rather these activists, for want of a better word, and that's really what we learn here, is that Madame and Miss Emily are activists, or were activists in some level, and maybe still are, to, I suppose, have these clones treated in a more humane manner. And this is really what starts to emerge. So in these chapters, it's as much about what is not said in some respects as what is said. And we learn that Hailsham was unusual. Now, we knew this right from the start of the story, that Kathy's experience was not like maybe a lot of others. And I spoke about how this novel was clearly addressed to someone or to some group, and really the effect that emerges here towards the end is that it was really addressed towards other clones maybe. Like I said, the effect is almost of a memoir of Kathy recalling her life from this particular moment, looking back, and sort of what got her to this particular point. So it has that quality to it, but it also, when we consider, I suppose, that audience and consider those other clones, it accounts for how proud Kathy was of the fact that she was a Hailsham student, and how other donors that she encountered in her life as a carer also attached great importance to that, and that as being a very significant part of her identity, because Hailsham represented something. And what we're really picturing together is that is, first of all, Hailsham is now gone, so maybe that particular phase of how clones were treated and dealt with and so on has now moved aside. And also that the grim reality for other clones is nothing like as pleasant as Kathy's recollections of her life. So again, some of that is more hinted at and suggested than directly stated, but there's certainly a strong suggestion emerging that is the reality. So a couple of things to flag. I'm just going to draw your attention on page 251, just to a line I'd like you to underline, because when we meet Miss Emily here, when she emerges literally and metaphorically, if you like, from the shadows in this chapter, and she says at the end, she's in a wheelchair, so she says at the end of this chapter, this is 4 lines from the bottom of page 251, sorry. I've not been well recently, but I'm hoping this contraption isn't a permanent fixture. Now, she's talking about the contraption being the wheelchair. The strong suggestion there, though, is that the fact that she's saying she hopes it won't be a permanent fixture is that whatever it is that is ailing her, whatever it is that is, wrong with her, whatever illness or otherwise, that she's looking at a curative thing. She's looking at a potential cure for this illness. The suggestion really is that maybe Miss Emily too, as much as she is an advocate for clone rights, for want of a better term, is also maybe going to be the recipient of an organ that will in some way rectify what's happening to her right now, that her injury in some way is debilitating, but that it will be, it's possible to cure it. And the strong suggestion there is that she too is going to avail of this program. And that's really kind of what emerges in here. So firstly, on page 252, we get confirmation, just about right towards the bottom of that page, final paragraph. 6 or 7 lines from the bottom highlight, I came to believe that this rumour, it's not just a single rumour. What I mean is, I think it's one that gets created from scratch over and over. And she's talking there explicitly about the deferrals, and that it is one of these persistent rumours that continues to arise, and even when they think they've stamped it out, it keeps coming back. Again, more evidence for what I was saying in yesterday's lesson about the clones desiring more life, this fundamental human need to live longer, if at all humanly possible. On page 254, we get this information about the gallery, and again, the configuration of the gallery. So again, about a third of the way down that page, just going to read a short passage here. The gallery. Well, that rumour did have some truth to it. There was a gallery, and after a fashion, there still is. These days, it's here in this house. I had to prune it down, which I regret, but there wasn't room for all of it in here. But why did we take your work away? That's what you're asking, isn't it? Not just that, I said quietly. Why did we do all that work in the first place? Why train us, encourage us, make us produce all of that? If we're just going to give donations anyway, then die, why all those lessons? Why all those books and discussions? And those are literally, these are Kathy's questions, but they're literally your questions as well. These are the questions that are raised, all like, what is the purpose of this? Why are we doing this? And so on. Why Hailsham at all? Highlight that line, Madame said. Said this, from the hallway. She came past us again and back into the darkened section of the room. It's a good question for you to ask. Miss Emily's gaze followed her and for a moment remained fixed behind us. I felt like turning to see what looks were being exchanged, but it was almost like we were back at Hailsham and we had to keep facing the front with complete attention. Then Miss Emily said, yes, why Hailsham at all? Mary Claude likes to ask that a lot these days. But not so long ago, before the Morningdale scandal, highlight those lines as well. She wouldn't have dreamt of asking a question like that. It wouldn't have entered her head. You know that's right, don't look at me like that. And so on. She's speaking to Mary Claude here, to Madame. But she goes on then in this passage to describe the function really and the idea behind the creativity. And this is again, just getting to the end of this paragraph, about a third of the way down, page 255, highlight the lines, or to put it more finely, we did it to prove you had souls at all. So this is confirming what Tommy was suspecting and this idea about souls and about, but it's really, don't again take the I suppose more simplistic idea of what a soul is. What you're talking about here is humanity, the essence of what it is to be a person. And that clearly there was this idea, as there persistently is about human beings and our relationship with art, not just art as in pictures, but art as in anything that we create, creativity, that element of humanity, that is part of being a human and part of being the experience of being human. So these endeavours by Miss Emily, Madame, and others like them were to try and prove that these clones were in fact human beings that should be treated like human beings. Now, the question that obviously leads to is, why would that ever need to be the case? So, I said a couple of things noting there, up to page 256 then. Get you to highlight at the very end of this page, last line on this page, second last and last line. Look at this art. So this is where Miss Emily is speaking about the motivation. She said, these were speeches, large funds, but there, look, we could say, look at this art. How dare you claim these children are anything less than fully human? So you highlight that. When we think about why all of this, why was this happening? This is the motivation. This is what these characters were attempting to do. And on page 257 then, again, more questions being answered, as in, why would people not see these clones as being human? Why would they, in some way, why would this even need to be proved? Well, this is where this question is addressed. So let's start at the last paragraph of page 257 and let's have a quick read of this passage. From your perspective today, Kathy, your bemusement is perfectly reasonable, but you must try and see it historically. So this is really important with regard to the cultural context. After the war, in the early 50s, when the great breakthroughs in science followed one after the other so rapidly, there wasn't time to take stock, to ask the sensible questions. Suddenly, there were all these new possibilities laid before us, all these ways to cure so many previously incurable conditions. This was what the world noticed the most, wanted the most. And for a long time, people preferred to believe these organs appeared from nowhere, or at most, that they grew in a kind of vacuum. Yes, there were arguments. But by the time people became concerned about students, by the time they came to consider just how you were reared, whether you should have been brought into existence at all, well, by then it was too late. There was no way to reverse the process. And these are the really significant lines, so maybe highlight these or put an asterisk beside them. How can you ask a world that has come to regard cancer as curable? How can you ask such a world to put away that cure, to go back to the dark days? There was no going back. However uncomfortable people were about your existence, their overwhelming concern was that their own children, their spouses, their parents, their friends did not die from cancer, motor neuron disease, heart disease. So that really puts all of this into context for us, because, and this is I was talking to you about this last week, about that, and even flag and writing in the margin there, morality, because that is the moral question that's at the center of this entire novel. If this kind of scenario did come to pass, would we be able to go back? Would people be able to let that go? And, it's easy to look at this outrageous idea, this would never happen and so on, but yet we do live in a world where exploitation of other human beings happens routinely. Just think about even some of the stories you hear about how your clothes are made and how some of your technology is made and where it comes from and the conditions under which many of the people who are responsible for creating those things live. Almost or in some cases depending on, but quite inhumane. So the moral thing here is we just have to be careful about how we manage that. And again, this is the genius of Ishiguro writing this novel from a first person perspective, because we are in Kathy's head, because it's her voice, because we feel the connection to the first person narrator. We see her, Tommy, Ruth, and so on. They're just people. They're just human beings. We sympathize naturally with them. We empathize, particularly with Kathy. So because we're coming at it from that perspective, we don't see it the way that Miss Emily is presenting it here, the way maybe other people in this context see it. And that is fundamental and really, really important around the world, the greater cultural context that these characters live in. A world where they are essentially seen, or at least willfully, I suppose, perceived as less than human beings. It's a very, very important part about the story. So again, make sure you flag that. Then there's a little bit of discussion around this Morningdale scandal, and that is certainly something that I suppose we could flag here. So there's all of this around Hailsham, what it represented, and so on. I'll talk to you guys more about this. One thing maybe to note there, and just to put it on your radar as well, is to think about the name or the word Hailsham. I think this is in the notes anyway, I've kind of flagged this, but thinking about what that word actually means, to hail somebody is to kind of wave at them or to greet them. But a sham is a fake. It's something that's not real. So there may be significance in that too, and certainly it has been speculated that it's a very particular choice of word to describe this school. But this Morningdale scandal, and this is something that is just referenced here, we don't know exactly, we're just told enough that we can kind of piece together the reality. So again, this is on page 258. I think it's 258. But yeah, a third of the way from the bottom. What's this Morningdale scandal you keep mentioning, Miss Emily? I asked. You have to tell us, because we don't know about it. Well, I suppose there's no reason why you should. It was never such a large matter in the wider world. It concerned a scientist called James Morningdale, quite talented in his way. He carried on his work in a remote part of Scotland, where I suppose he thought he'd attract less attention. What he wanted was to offer people the possibility of having children with enhanced characteristics, superior intelligence, superior athleticism, that sort of thing. Of course, there'd been others with similar ambitions, but this Morningdale fellow, he'd taken his research much further than anyone before him, far beyond legal boundaries. Well, he was discovered, they put an end to his work, and that seemed to be that. Except, of course, it wasn't, not for us. As I say, it never became an enormous matter. Maybe highlight or note this line, but it did create a certain atmosphere, you see. It reminded them of fears they'd always had. It's one thing to create students, such as yourselves, for the donation program. but a generation of created children who take their place in society. Children demonstrably superior to the rest of us. Oh no, that frightened people. They recoiled from that. So that's a very significant thing, because again, it's the degrees to which this kind of technology is acceptable and how people perceive it and which elements of it they're okay with, again, understandably, and which elements terrify them. So a lot there of sort of, information and things about, so why was Hailsham closed down? Why did more and more places like this not exist? Why do other clones attach such importance to it? Essentially because it was a fairly unique place in that respect. So just really, I suppose, a couple of other things to flag in there. Page 262, we have Miss Lucy reference, and Tommy and Kathy bring her to Miss Emily and Madame's attention. Interestingly, she's not really on their radar, but then they kind of talk about her. The significance of this is creating a certain atmosphere. And then when we have Miss Lucy, we're talking about this idea. I mentioned this already about the idealist. What's significant here is maybe her importance to the students, to Kathy and Tommy as a memory and so on. And she's also representative, a different view. So when we're talking about the cultural context here, we are always talking about culture in a general, broad sense, but we're also considering here the cultural context, and that there are people out there in this cultural context who don't see things the same way as maybe the greater culture. So Miss Lucy represents another point of view, an idealist, somebody who comes in and did want to change things. And I mentioned this at the time as well, but just again, it's kind of clarified for us here. And this is really what chapter 22 is all about, is clarification. A lot of things we already suspected and knew, just been kind of, our attention just been drawn to them, and just clarification around what all those things mean. Then, of course, there's on page 266, just one last final event, I suppose, worth noting here, is the exchange of the memory. Second last thing to note in this chapter, the exchange of the memory between Madame and Kathy. So this is starting on page 266, and this is again the memory that revolves around the song, around Never Let Me Go, around that specific scene that we've talked about a couple of times. So very much a key moment that our attention has been drawn to, and how Kathy remembers that as being something, where she perceived it a particular way, and Madame perceived it in a very different way, and how she finishes off this conversation with, "You poor creatures," she replied, almost in a whisper. Then she turned and went back into her house. So, a very heartbreaking sort of moment, very disappointing and dispiriting, hugely significant in establishing the general vision and viewpoint, because all of the letdowns and the disappointments, and while we can sort of gain maybe some solace from the fact that Madame and Miss Emily and Miss Lucy and people like that exist in this world, representing or trying to change attitudes and views, the abiding sense is of utter futility. That the greater, I suppose, demands and expectations of this culture have taken over, that Miss Emily, Madame and so on are actually, their cause has been defeated by and large. And again, the slightly maybe sinister suggestion that Miss Emily herself, now that she's in a position where her health is compromised, will actually be also availing of the donation program and the clones. And again, really, really disappointing, really dispiriting. So the final thing maybe worth noting here about regards to all this clarity and so on is Tommy and his fit of rage, one that he hasn't had. And remember, this novel and so on, this narrative is in many ways almost bookended to some extent by those fits. What do they mean? Well, again, we can speculate, but the interpretation really is again about this deep-seated, almost unconscious anger that Tommy has that was recognizable from a very young age, and here it is manifesting again. It's a rage brought on by frustration, brought on by some fundamental sense of injustice about the reality of their existence, and that seems to be the strong suggestion that's emerging there. So again, seeing Tommy as a sort of a tragic figure, but where his humanity is being quashed to such an extent that it just manifests in these fits of rage, the deep-seated rage. So which brings us on to the final chapter, chapter 23. Again, what's noteworthy in here? This is very much a kind of a chapter around sort of resolution, tying up loose ends. The significant thing, of course, is Kathy and Tommy parting ways, and Kathy sort of, naturally, almost like, the deferral, once that wasn't going to work out, that they just sort of naturally, organically, I suppose, drifted apart and so on. But Kathy very much feels the outsider in the early part of this chapter. She starts to recognise that as a carer, she doesn't have a certain connection with these donors. So this is kind of tying back into what we knew from earlier in the story, that her time as a carer is coming to an end, and she's almost ready to kind of take that next step. Let me just draw your attention to page 277. So just around a third of the way down this page, just to highlight this one paragraph, beginning with, "I suppose you're right, Kath. You are a really good carer. You'd be the perfect one for me too if you weren't you." He did a laugh and put his arm around me, though we kept sitting side by side. Then he said, "I keep thinking about this river somewhere, with the water moving really fast. And these two people in the water are trying to hold on to each other, holding on as hard as they can, but in the end, it's just too much. The current's too strong. They've got to let go, drift apart. That's how I think it is with you." And maybe highlight this line. "It's a shame, Kath, because we've loved each other all our lives. But in the end, we can't stay together forever." Like the tragic element to those lines, the sense of, again, the disappointment, the unfulfilled lives, the imagery there of the two drowning people almost hanging on to one another connects, of course, with the title of the novel, "They Never Let Me Go," and it takes on this extended significant meaning where this novel almost becomes like a desperately sad love story in a sense that never was between these two characters of Kathy and Tommy. And the open admission here by Tommy that they've loved each other their whole lives, which Kathy never fully acknowledges and articulates, but it doesn't take much to join the dots and see that. So in the end, when she leaves, Tommy moves on. There's this little low-level resentment still for Ruth and the way she kept them apart. Again, completely understandable and completely human. But everything then really is about the ending. So moving to page 281, again, I'd just like to draw your attention here to the final paragraphs. Just this final imagery here. I'll start right at the bottom of the page. "I found I was standing before acres of ploughed earth. There was a fence keeping me from stepping into the field with 2 lines of barbed wire, and I could see how this fence and the cluster of 3 or 4 trees above me were the only things breaking the wind for miles. All along the fence, especially along the lower line of wire, all sorts of rubbish had caught and tangled. It was like the debris you get on a seashore. The wind must have carried some of it for miles and miles before finally coming up against these trees and these 2 lines of wire. Up in the branches of the trees too, I could see flapping about torn plastic sheeting and bits of old carrier bags. That was the only time, as I stood there looking at that strange rubbish, feeling the wind coming across those empty fields, that I started to imagine just a little fantasy thing. Because this was Norfolk after all, and it was only a couple of weeks since I'd lost him. I was thinking about the rubbish, the flapping plastic in the branches, the shoreline of odd stuff caught along the fencing, and I half closed my eyes and imagined this was the spot where everything I'd ever lost since my childhood had washed up. And I was now standing here in front of it, and if I waited long enough, a tiny figure would appear on the horizon, across the field, and gradually get larger until I'd see it was Tommy, and he'd wave, maybe even call. The fantasy never got beyond that. I didn't let it. And though the tears rolled down my face, I wasn't sobbing or out of control. I just waited a bit, then turned back to the car to drive off to wherever it was I was supposed to be. So the tragic ending there, the bleak imagery, the desolation, the loneliness, the imagery of the rubbish caught in the barbed wire, so significant, all of it capturing a heartbroken person, a character, who has lost everything. And we talk about vision and viewpoint, and just to sort of draw your attention again, just now that we've kind of wrapped up the story and we've kind of, to the resolution and that phase and how it all ends, it's so tragic, so sad. But everything about Kathy, her reflections, her behaviour at the end, I ask you the question, I suppose, is there any evidence here that she's anything less than human, as with any of the characters and what we've seen? And really, I think we can kind of certainly see Ishiguro's attempt there. So just to remind you when you're going through, so what you need to do now is go to the back of your comparative notes, start looking at your comparative modes, and start to complete those tables where you're considering particularly cultural context and general vision and viewpoint. Now this final chapter, general vision and viewpoint, when you look at, again, thinking about the board over here, these are our 3 modes. Don't worry too much about theme or issue, I'll talk more about that next week. Cultural context, general vision and viewpoint. What do you notice about these world? Follow those prompts, fill it in. This is a really, really bleak, pessimistic and negative ending to this story. Was it ever any other way? Remember, we think about formation of the vision, how was it established? Did it change or was that reinforced throughout the novel? At what particular key moments? So thinking again about 3 or 4 key moments. I'll talk to you about the modes anyway a bit next week, but just this ending particularly and what that tells you about the general vision and viewpoint. So keep a record of it, keep a record of the significance of all these things, and I will chat to you guys next week. Thanks.